In a luxurious seaside restaurant, a millionaire accustomed to humiliating those he considers inferior decides to test the limits of a simple waitress in front of everyone. With an arrogant comment about a French wine, he believes he is about to expose her ignorance, but he has no idea that he is about to expose himself to the entire room. In a few seconds, silence takes over the environment when an unexpected response turns the game and puts each person there in their proper place. And what begins as an attempt at public humiliation transforms into a night capable of changing destinies, perceptions, and even feelings. Before discovering how a simple answer in French made a millionaire swallow his own pride, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more surprising stories. The Atlantic breeze arrived gently through the open window of Terrasso Ancora, carrying the smell of salt and the promise of a warm night. It was Friday in Santos, and the most coveted restaurant on the waterfront was already living its routine of elegance and silent tension, the kind that only those who work in a high-standard dining room truly know. The white marble tables reflected the golden lamps, and the murmur of conversations mixed with the soft sound of the piano played by a discreet musician in the corner of the hall. Isabella Fontana tied her apron with a firm knot at her waist and took a deep breath before pushing the kitchen door. 26 years old, honey-colored eyes, black hair tied in an impeccable bun, she carried in her hands the ease of someone who learned to serve without diminishing herself. For the regular customers of Terrasso Ancora, she was simply the waitress with beautiful eyes who knew the menu by heart. For her co-workers, she was the one who studied gastronomy in the morning and worked until midnight without complaining. For herself, she was someone who still had a long way to go, and she knew it with a certainty that did not fit on any of the trays she balanced with perfection. Terrasso Ancora was on the top floor of the Hotel Farol do Sul, overlooking the canal and the port. It wasn't the most famous restaurant in São Paulo, but it was the most exclusive in the Baixada Santista, frequented by executives, ship owners, and politicians who understood that greatness sometimes lives far from the center. The owner, Seu Raimundo Alcântara, was a 70-year-old man with a white moustache and eyes that saw everything but pretended to see nothing. Isabella had worked there for 2 years. She arrived with a modest resume and 18 months of lion in her body, an internship at a gastronomy school, work in a bistro in the historic center. She didn't mention this in the interview. She only said she liked cooking and needed the job. Seu Raimundo hired her on the spot. That night, Isabella was responsible for the 4 tables on the covered veranda, where the special customers sat, the ones who asked for the sommelier, the ones who demanded constant attention without saying it. She knew this type. She knew how to move among them without being invisible and without being intrusive. The night began quietly, a table of couples celebrating a birthday, another with 2 men in suits discussing numbers in low voices, the third, empty, already prepared with the centerpiece of white flowers that had arrived from the florist that afternoon. And then, at 21 hours and 17 minutes, Isabella looked at the clock because the movement at the entrance always kept her alert. The group arrived that would change everything. There were 4 people, 3 foreign men, with the kind of clothes that have no visible brand but cost enough to buy a popular car, and a Brazilian who walked in front of everyone with the naturalness of someone accustomed to occupying any space they desire. Tall, broad shoulders, brown hair slightly graying at the temples, he had that specific security of someone who never needed to prove anything to anyone, or at least believed so. He wore a watch that Isabella recognized from afar as being from a Swiss brand, whose cheapest model cost more than 6 months of her salary combined. The maitre d' led them to table 3, the best on the veranda. The Brazilian settled into the head of the table without being invited, as if the gesture were automatic, a force of nature. The 3 foreigners, 2 Germans and a Belgian, Isabella would later discover, sat down with that discreet politeness of those who are in foreign territory and prefer to observe before giving an opinion. Isabella approached with the menu. The Brazilian man barely looked up. "Good evening. My name is Isabella and I will be at your disposal tonight. May I bring the wine list while you analyze the menu?" "You can bring everything at once," he said without looking at her. "And still water for the table." She brought everything. While distributing the menus, she noticed that the man had already taken control of the conversation in English. explaining the house specialties to the visitors, with an authority that implied he knew the place, which Isabella quickly realized was not true. He was improvising with a lot of confidence, which is different from knowing. "My name is Renato Cavalcanti," he said to the foreigners in slightly heavy English. "This restaurant is one of the best in the state. Trust me with the choices." The Germans nodded. The Belgian smiled politely. Isabella stood a step away, ready to take the order, observing everything with that attention that people tend to ignore in those who serve. Renato opened the wine list with a wide gesture, sweeping the pages with his eyes like someone looking for something specific. When he found it, he tapped the page lightly with 2 fingers. "This one here. Let's go with this one." Isabella approached to take notes. He pointed to the name on the menu without pronouncing it. She looked. It was a Châteauneuf du Pape of an exceptional vintage, a wine from the Rhône Valley that she had served only 3 times in 2 years, and all 3 times to customers who knew exactly what they were ordering. "Does the gentleman know this label?" she asked in the most neutral tone she could manage. Renato Cavalcanti finally looked her in the eyes, and in his gaze there was something she recognized immediately, the irritation of someone not used to being questioned by someone he considers to be below him. "I know it, yes. Why? Is there a problem?" "None, sir. I just wanted to confirm the choice because it is a full-bodied red, and depending on the dishes you choose, I can suggest a more precise pairing." He looked away. "You can bring that very one." Isabella took the note, turned around and walked back to the kitchen with firm and calm steps. It wasn't time to say anything yet. It wasn't necessary yet. But she already knew, with that intuition that 2 years on the floor and 18 months in Lyon had sharpened in her like a good knife, that the night still had much to reveal. In the kitchen, Chef Marcos Teixeira received her with an interrogative look. There was a relationship of silent respect between them, the kind of understanding that is born when 2 people take their work seriously without needing to say it. "Table 3 ordered Châteauneuf du Pape," she said, hanging up the notepad. "They haven't chosen a dish yet." Marcos frowned slightly. With the sea right there and the menu focused on seafood and noble fish, that wine would be like wearing a wool jacket on a summer day in Santos, possible but uncomfortable. He said nothing. It was the customer's decision. Isabella went to the climate-controlled cellar, selected the bottle with care, checked the temperature, and took it to the table in a wicker basket lined with cream linen. While presenting the label, she observed that Renato barely looked at the bottle. He made a vague gesture like someone dismissing a formality. The foreigners, on the contrary, leaned in with genuine attention. The Belgian read the information with the care of someone who understands what they are reading. Isabella opened the wine with the precision that practice makes invisible. She served a small amount for Renato to taste. He took the glass, swirled the liquid twice without technique, took a sip, and nodded as if approving a boring report. "Great serve, everyone." She served the table in silence, starting with the guest to the right of the host as etiquette dictates. The Belgian held the glass by the stem, brought his nose close with delicacy, and looked at her with a slight smile. The smile of someone who found an unexpected acquaintance in a strange city. There was a code there, silent and precise, between people who share a language that is not made of words. Isabella recognized it, and she continued working. The orders from table 3 came in a cascade, as usually happens when the host wants to impress and the guests are waiting. Renato Cavalcanti ordered for the table without consulting anyone: an appetizer of gratin oysters, tuna carpaccio with capers, grilled sea bass with a herb crust for everyone, and a second bottle of the same wine before the first was half finished. Isabella took the note. Gratin oysters with a full-bodied red from the Rhône would make any sommelier frown. But it wasn't her place to impose anything yet. She returned to the table to serve water, and noticed that the conversation had changed tone. The Germans were asking questions about port investments, something Isabella associated with Renato's profile. Santos was the largest port in Latin America. There was money circulating there in volumes that most people would never see in their lives, and there were men like Renato who lived in this circuit like fish in a known sea. The Belgian maintained an elegant silence. His name was Peter, she would later discover. the type who listens a lot before speaking and who pulled back slightly every time she approached to serve. It was then that Renato began to talk about wines to the Germans, an almost monologue, in which he discoursed on regions, vintages and labels with fluency and confidence. Isabella, who was serving the bread basket at the next table, listened while she worked. There was correct information interspersed with small mistakes, the kind that goes unnoticed by those who don't know the subject, but that for her sounded like an out-of-tune note in a melody she had in her memory. Then he pronounced the name of the wine. He was telling one of the Germans about the label they had ordered, building a narrative about the sophistication of the choice, and he said the name out loud with a pronunciation that mixed French with American English in a way that produced something that was neither one nor the other. Chateau Neuf du Pape was more or less what came out. Isabella was 2 meters away, her back to the table, tidying the service station. She felt the moment she said nothing. But Renato turned to her, as if he had noticed her presence, as if her silence were worth more than any comment. "Do you know the name of this wine?" he asked, with that specific intonation that wasn't really a question. It was a trap. It was an invitation for her to say she didn't know, thus confirming what he had already decided she was: decorative and limited. Isabella closed the station drawer softly and turned around. "Yes, sir." He tilted his head slightly. "Say it then." There was a 2-second silence. The pianist in the corner of the room was between songs. The table next to them had stopped talking without realizing it. Pieter, the Belgian, set down his glass with care. Isabella looked directly at Renato Cavalcanti and said, in impeccable French, with the accent of someone who learned the language listening to people who were born into it, "Château Neuf du Pape, appellation d'origine contrôlée du Rhône méridional, classée parmi les plus prestigieuses de France." The silence that followed had texture. It was possible to touch it. Renato blinked once. The 2 Germans exchanged a quick look. Pieter raised his eyebrows in a gesture that was, unequivocally, of admiration. Isabella did not wait for his reaction. She continued, now in Portuguese, with the same calmness of someone who is simply informing, "It is a wine from the southern Rhône Valley, made with Grenache grapes as a base, with possible additions of Syrah and Mourvèdre, depending on the producer. This specific vintage was considered exceptional by specialized critics. It is a wine of intense structure, with present tannins and notes of spices, dark fruits, and a mineral touch that comes from the rolled pebble soil characteristic of the region. For the dishes you chose, especially the gratin oysters and the tuna carpaccio, I would suggest considering a white from the same region, perhaps a Châteauneuf du Pape Blanc, which would pair much more elegantly with the seafood. But the red you chose will express itself better, starting with the sea base, especially with the herb crust." She said all this without raising her voice, without a tone of challenge, without the slightest sign that she was doing anything other than informing, as if it were just her job, because it was. Renato Cavalcanti looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pure embarrassment. It was something more complex, an intermediate state between the discomfort of being surprised and the impossibility of denying what he had just heard. The Belgian Pieter broke the silence with a comment in English directed at the Germans. "She is absolutely right about the pairing." He said this naturally, as if he were just agreeing with something obvious, which made the situation even more definitive. Renato nodded slowly, like someone accepting information they didn't ask for, but cannot refuse. "All right," he said. "You can bring what you suggested then, the white." Isabella bowed her head slightly. "Excellent choice, sir. I'll be back in a moment." She walked back to the cellar with the same calm step as always. Only when she reached the side corridor, away from the gazes, did she let out a long sigh, not of relief, but of something that felt like balance, like when a piece that was slightly crooked returns to its natural place. The cellar of Terrazzo Ancora was a small, fragrant room with stone walls and amber lighting. Isabella liked to go in there during her breaks, just to let the smell of cork and tannin remind her of Lyon, of the internship afternoons in the school's cellars, of the Saturdays when the chef-teacher Henri Beaumont would have her identify wines blindly, laughing at her accent when she pronounced the names wrong at the beginning. She had learned French the hard way. With shame, with mistakes, with persistence. She had arrived in France with a worn pocket dictionary and a stubbornness that people took time to understand, but eventually came to respect. 18 months. That's what it took to feel at home in a language that wasn't hers, and now that language was part of her, like a muscle memory, present without effort, natural without ostentation. She selected a bottle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape Blanc, checked the temperature, prepared the ice bucket, and returned to the dining room. Passing by the maitre d' station, she noticed that Donizetti, the head maitre d', a 60-year-old man with the dignity that only comes from decades of craft, was watching her with an imperceptible smile. He had heard everything, or enough. He said nothing. He just nodded once. Back at table 3, the atmosphere had changed in a subtle but real way. The two Germans now looked at her with genuine attention, not with the polite indifference reserved for those who serve. Renato Cavalcanti had his elbows resting on the table, looking at the canal outside. When she arrived, he turned his face with an expression she was still trying to decode. The arrogance had slipped to a deeper place. That kind of thing doesn't disappear in 10 minutes. But there was space now where before there was only certainty. Isabella presented the bottle, briefly explained the characteristics of the white wine, opened it, and served. When she handed the glass to Peter, he said in Portuguese, with an accent but understandably, "Did you study in France?" "Yes, sir, in Lyon." "Lyon is the gastronomic capital of the world," he said with conviction. She smiled, a real smile, not the professional one. "I agree with you, sir." Renato watched the exchange without participating. He was a man used to being the center of any conversation. Feeling that the center had shifted was clearly a new sensation for him. She served everyone, asked if they needed anything else, and walked away. But before turning her back, she heard Renato speak in a low voice to Peter, in English. "She is a very unusual waitress." Peter replied without lowering his voice, "Or perhaps it is you who are not used to noticing who is around you." Isabella did not stop. She didn't need to. That sentence had already reached where it needed to go. The dinner at table 3 continued under a new gravitation. It was as if the wine episode had redistributed the invisible weight that exists at every table where there is power and hierarchy. That weight that defines who speaks and who serves, who is heard and who is ignored. Something had changed, and everyone around the table noticed, even if no one said it out loud. Renato Cavalcanti ate the gratin oysters in relative silence, responding to the German's questions with shorter answers than before. Isabella noticed that he had leaned back slightly in his chair, crossed his arms for a moment, and then uncrossed them. The kind of body language she had learned to read on the floor like someone reading the sky before the rain. He was processing, recalculating. The Germans, in turn, seemed more at ease than at the beginning of the night. Klaus, the taller of the two with round glasses and a voice that sounded like grain being ground, had begun to ask questions directly to Isabella about the dishes, something that customers normally don't do with waitresses in the presence of a dominant host. It was a subtle crack in the hierarchy that Renato had built, and Isabella answered the questions with the same objectivity as always, without inflating the moment, without taking advantage of the opening for anything beyond what was asked. The tuna carpaccio arrived embellished with capers, Sicilian lemon zest, and a thin line of extra virgin olive oil that Chef Marcos had distributed with the precision of someone signing a canvas. Isabella served the dishes at the right pace, checked if everyone was comfortable, and moved away to the service station from where she could observe the table without being observed. It was there that she saw the moment when Renato drank the white wine for the first time. An involuntary pause in the middle of a sentence, a more careful second sip. He continued talking as if nothing had happened. But it had happened. Isabella saw it. The Châteauneuf-du-Pape Blanc she had chosen had those characteristics that make certain white wines impossible to ignore. A minerality that recalled limestone, a vibrant acidity that cut through the fat of the oysters with elegance, and a discreet floral background that appeared only at the end, like a signature. It was a wine that didn't ask for attention, but won it. Renato Cavalcanti had been won over without realizing it, and that was, in a way, the best possible response to everything that had happened before. The dinner progressed. Isabella managed the other tables on the veranda with the same care, circulating among them without leaving any abandoned, maintaining that delicate balance that is the real art of floor service. The pianist had changed to a softer, almost intimate repertoire, and the light on the veranda grew increasingly golden as the night advanced over the canal. It was around 22:30 that Renato Cavalcanti called her, not with an imperious gesture, as he had done at the beginning of the night, with a simple look in her direction which she caught from afar and corresponded to with a calm approach. "Yes, sir?" He stayed a second without speaking. He had his fingers interlaced over the table, his shoulders slightly lowered, a different posture from his arrival, when he had entered the restaurant like someone who owns the space. "This wine you brought," he said finally. "It's very good." She didn't smile excessively. "I'm glad it pleased you." He nodded. And then, as if the next sentence cost something, "You made the right choice. I was wrong in the previous order." Isabella looked at him for a second. It was a small admission, formulated in an oblique way, but it was an admission. In that environment, with that profile, she knew how much that cost. "The gentleman made a great choice by accepting the suggestion," she said, returning the protagonism to him without lying. "This is exactly the type of white that makes the tuna carpaccio reveal the best of itself." He looked at her for another second, and for the first time that night, there was something in his face that wasn't a performance. It was real attention. "Are you going to graduate in gastronomy?" he asked. "Later this year, sir, if all goes well." He nodded again, slowly. And then he turned to resume the conversation with the Germans, but there was something different in the angle of his body. An openness that wasn't there before, as if he had turned slightly in the direction of something he didn't yet know how to name. Isabella went back to the service station. Maître de Donizete was there, adjusting the next day's reservation list, and looked at her with that contained smile that was, for him, the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Table 3 is under control," she whispered. "It always was," he replied. "Only now he knows it too." She didn't answer. But while reorganizing the clean glasses on the shelf, she let that sentence settle slowly inside her. There was something Renato Cavalcanti didn't know, that no one in that restaurant knew, except for Seu Raimundo, who had discovered by accident months before upon finding a document forgotten in an employee's folder. Isabella Fontana was not just a gastronomy student who had lived in Lyon for 18 months. She was the youngest daughter of Antonio Fontana, the same Antonio Fontana who had founded the largest distributor of imported beverages in the state of São Paulo in the 80s and sold the business for a fortune at 52, opting for a simple life in the countryside. She had grown up in a large house in Campinas, with a cellar in the basement and French wines at dinner for as long as she could remember. She had learned the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy before learning to ride a bicycle. And she had chosen, at 22, after graduating from high school at a top-tier private school, to go to Lyon with a scholarship she had won herself, without using her father's name, without using her father's money, without using anything of her father's, besides the refined palate he had inadvertently passed on to her. She had returned to Brazil with the intention of completing her degree in gastronomy and eventually opening her own business. In the meantime, work. Learn the side of service that school doesn't teach. Understand the workings of a dining room from the inside, with an apron and a notebook, without a safety net. Seu Raimundo discovered the story by accident and promised secrecy. He had looked at her with that gaze of someone who recognizes something rare and said only, "Then you don't need to be here." She had replied, "That is exactly why I am." And he hadn't asked anything else. That night, as the dinner at table 3 reached the dessert phase, Isabella thought about that choice with the clarity that only the fatigue of a long Friday brings. She could have used the last name. She could have arrived at Terrazzo Ancora as a special guest instead of an employee. She could have met Renato Cavalcanti at a table as an equal, with a glass in her hand and expensive clothes, and he never would have tried to humiliate her. But then she would never know what he was when he thought there were no consequences. She would never know what any of them were. That was the thing the simple life had taught her, that a person's character is revealed not in what they do when they are being watched, but in what they do when they believe no one important is seeing. And there was something in that lesson that she wanted to keep learning every day, in an apron and with the smell of salt coming from the canal. The grilled sea bass arrived at table 3 with an impeccable presentation. Isabella served the plates with the usual care and stepped back to let the moment happen. Renato Cavalcanti looked at the plate, then at her, and said only, "Thank you." Not in the automatic way one thanks those who serve. In the other way, the one that recognizes a person. She nodded and walked away. As she walked, she thought that perhaps the night still had one more twist in store. And she was right. The apology came at the moment Isabella least expected, not because it was unlikely, but because it happened in the most stripped-down way she could imagine. It was almost midnight. The other tables had already emptied. Table 3 was the last on the veranda. The Germans had ordered a digestive and were giving signs of closing, looks at the watch, comments about the morning flight. Peter, the Belgian, had left earlier, called by a phone call that took him discreetly away from the table with a polite apology. Before leaving, he found Isabella at the service station and said, in a low voice, that the night had been exceptional. He said this with the sobriety of someone who doesn't praise out of courtesy. There was a respect between them that dispensed with elaborations. When the Germans finally stood up to go, Renato accompanied the two to the entrance, exchanged handshakes, promised to return messages, and went back to the table. Alone. He sat down again in the head chair, but this time without the command posture. His shoulders were slightly curved, his tie loosened 2 centimeters, the glass with the last bit of white wine in front of him, which he looked at for a few seconds before drinking. Isabella approached to remove the German's plates. He looked up when she arrived. "You can let me finish," he said, "if you don't mind." "Of course, sir. Feel free." She began to remove only what was obvious, the empty plates, the dirty glasses, and left his glass and the bread basket. While she worked, he remained in silence for almost an entire minute, looking at the canal outside, where the port lights drew irregular reflections on the surface of the water. Then he said, without turning, "I was rude to you earlier." She stopped. She held a plate with both hands and stood still for a second. Then she continued to organize the items on the tray with the same care as always. "The gentleman was direct," she replied. "There is a difference." He turned then and looked at her with an attention different from everything he had shown during the night. It was as if he were finally seeing who was there, not what he had presumed was there. "I wasn't," he said. "I tried to diminish you. I thought I could, and I was wrong." Isabella set the tray down softly on the edge of the table. She looked at him, not defiantly, not with triumph, but with the serene frankness of someone who needs nothing more than what they already have. "I accept what the gentleman said, and I thank you." He sat with that for a moment. Then he asked, "Did you really graduate in Lyon?" "I did an internship and worked there for 18 months. I'm finishing my degree here in Santos. And what do you want to do after?" The question was simple, but there was something behind it that wasn't simple. It was the question of someone who spent the whole night assuming they knew what the other person was, and who, upon being proven wrong, wanted to start from zero. Isabella thought for a second before answering, "I want to have my own space, not necessarily a conventional restaurant, something that brings together gastronomy, wines, and culture in a more integrated way, a place that tells stories through food." Renato listened to her without interrupting, and when she finished, he stayed in silence for a while longer before saying, "That is more concrete than it seems." "To me, it is concrete," she replied naturally. He gave a low laugh. The first genuine laugh of the night, without an audience, without a performance. It had a quality different from everything that had come out of him until then. It was the laughter of a person who recognizes themselves in a situation they didn't expect to be in. "You know," he said then, "I came here tonight to close a deal with the Germans, and what I'm going to remember most about tonight isn't the deal. It's that a waitress taught me the difference between 2 wines and demanded politeness from me without raising her voice." Isabella looked at him for a second. The port canal sparkled outside, patient and indifferent as always. "Perhaps that says something about what the gentleman truly values," she said carefully, without malice. He stared at her, and for the second time that night she saw him behind the armor, not the businessman, not the millionaire with the Swiss watch, but the man who had stayed behind after everyone left, who had apologized for real, and who was now sitting alone in a seaside restaurant talking to the waitress who had scrambled all his certainties in a single night. Renato Cavalcanti asked for the bill, left a tip whose value Isabella would only discover when Donizete called her later with wide eyes, and stood up to leave. At the door, he turned one last time. "What is your full name?" "Isabella Fontana." He repeated the name in a low voice, like someone fixing a reference. Then he went through the revolving door and disappeared into the Santos night. Isabella stood still for a second in the empty room, listening to the pianist play the last chords of the last song of that Friday. The piano went silent, note by note, until only the sound of the wind coming from the canal and the distant clinking of glasses being washed in the pantry remained. Donizete approached with the closed folder in his hand. He opened it, showed the tip amount without saying anything. Isabella looked. It was the equivalent of almost 2 weeks of her salary. She folded the slip and put it in her apron pocket. "It's not about the money," she said. "It never is," he replied. "But sometimes money is the only language certain men know how to use to say what they can't say in any other way." She thought about that while helping to close the veranda, folding the tablecloths, collecting the flower centerpieces, blowing out the candles one by one. The ritual of closing was one of the things she had learned to appreciate. That quiet hour when the restaurant sheds the night's apparatus and goes back to being simply a space waiting for the next day. The following week on Tuesday, Renato Cavalcanti returned. Tuesdays used to be quiet at Terrazzo Ancora, with sparse reservations and a slower pace. Isabella was tidying the service station when Donizete approached. "Table 2 on the veranda, reservation for 1, specifically asked for you." She turned slowly. "Asked for me?" "By name. Isabella Fontana. Said she was the waitress from Friday." She took a deep breath, grabbed the notepad and went to the veranda. Renato Cavalcanti was sitting at table 2 with a completely different posture from the last time. Without the Germans, without the tie, without the ostentatious watch, or rather with the same watch, but she noticed there was something different in the way he carried it, as if now she could see the object instead of the status statement it intended to be. He wore a simple, light shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow. He looked smaller. He looked more real. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cavalcanti." He looked up, and there was something in his eyes she recognized. The vulnerability of someone who made a decision and still doesn't know if it was the right one. "Good afternoon, Isabella. You can call me Renato." She said neither yes nor no. She took the menu and presented it with the same professionalism as always. "What would the gentleman like to drink while you decide?" He closed the menu without opening it. "I want you to choose everything, dish and wine. I trust your judgment." It was a short sentence, but for Isabella, who had heard that same man say, "Trust me with the choices" to the foreigners 3 days earlier, this inversion had a weight that went far beyond words. It was a voluntary surrender, a declaration that something had changed. She looked at him for a second, assessing the seriousness of the request. It was genuine. She nodded. "With pleasure." And this time, the pleasure was real. Tuesday's dinner lasted almost 3 hours. Isabella chose for Renato a whitefish ceviche with leche de tigre and cilantro, followed by a grouper slowly roasted in herb oil with manioc puree, and, to accompany it, an albarino from Spanish Galicia, dry mineral, with that precise acidity that works like an honest conversation between the wine and the sea. He tasted everything with the attention of someone learning a new language, and he kept asking questions. Real questions, not the kind one asks to seem interested, but the kind born of genuine curiosity. Why this wine with this fish? How the lèche de tigre works on the texture? What differentiates an albarino from a Sauvignon Blanc? Isabella answered everything with objectivity, without oversimplifying and without exhibitionism. He told her that he had grown up in Santos, that his father was a stevedore and his mother sold sweets at the school gate, that he had studied civil engineering with a full scholarship, worked in construction companies for a decade before setting up his own port logistics company, and that the company had grown in a way he hadn't predicted, and that sometimes still surprised him. He said this without excessive pride, more like someone describing a landscape than someone exhibiting an achievement. Isabella listened to it all, and while she listened, she thought there was something in his path that she recognized, not the path itself, which was radically different from hers, but the willingness to build something from zero, not to depend on a pre-assembled network, to reach a place by the force of one's own movement. She had done the same, in her own way. She had gone to Lyon without her father's name. She had returned and asked for a job in an apron. "Did you never want to make things easier?" she asked at a certain point, and only later realized the question was as much about him as it was about her. He smiled, a deeper smile than any she had seen in him before. "Always. But there are things that only have value if you reach them by the whole path." She sat with that for a second, then she nodded slowly. Dessert was a tapioca pudding with passion fruit syrup and coconut ice cream, one of Chef Marcos's creations that mixed the São Paulo coast with the effective memory of the Northeast. Renato ate it all. Then he was silent for a moment, looking at the cup of coffee that had arrived without him asking, because Isabella had noticed that he drank coffee at the end of the meal and had discreetly instructed the pantry. "You notice everything, don't you?" he said. "It's the job," she replied. "No, it's you." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. There was between the two a tension that wasn't exactly romantic, or perhaps it was, but it was still in a stage prior to that, in that space that exists between mutual recognition and what one does with it. Isabella was conscious of this tension with the practical clarity of someone who knows the limits of the floor. There was an asymmetry of position there that she did not ignore. She was in an apron, and he was on this side of the table, and she had learned, with time and experience, that mixing these two planes without care was a guaranteed way to complicate everything. But there was something she couldn't deny, which became clearer each Tuesday he returned, because he returned the following week and the one after. Renato Cavalcanti was a different man when he was at that table. Without the audience of executives and foreigners, without the performance of someone who needs to occupy space, he was calmer, more curious, more honest. It was as if the restaurant, or perhaps she, functioned as a decompression chamber where he could exist without needing to prove anything. On the third Tuesday, he arrived with a proposal. "Isabella, I have a professional question to put to you. It might not interest you, and if it doesn't, there's no problem at all. But I need to ask you." She waited. "I am organizing a business event here in Santos next month. A dinner for a group of international investors and partners, 30 people, in a space I am still defining. I need someone who understands gastronomy and service to help curate the menu and coordinate the experience. Not as a waitress, as a consultant." Isabella was silent for a few seconds. She looked at him with attention, reading what was behind the proposal. There was no condescension. There was no gesture of someone who is buying something or creating an obligation. It was the proposal of someone who had identified a competence and was making a professional offer. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. There's no rush." She nodded, and while removing the empty coffee cup, she thought that was one of the rare situations where thinking for real was what needed to be done, because the answer wasn't simple, and the reasons weren't simple, and there was much more at stake than a business dinner. That night, back in her apartment in Gonzaga, Isabella stood on the veranda with a glass of water and the notebook where she wrote down recipes and ideas. The breeze came from the same direction as always, carrying salt and the lightness of Santos on weeknights. She thought of her father. Antonio Fontana had built an imported beverage distributor from a simple idea and a persistence that no one had bet would be enough. He worked for 30 years, sold the business when he understood it was the time, and began living quietly in Campinas, taking care of a small vineyard in the backyard. He never asked for credit for anything, and he had never given his daughter a ready-made path. "You're going to have to build your own," he had said. She had taken that sentence to France and brought it back, And now Renato was offering her an opportunity that the Fontana name could have provided in 15 minutes with a phone call. But it was arriving in another way. It arrived through the apron, through the Châteauneuf du Pape, through the coffee she had served without being asked because she had paid attention. It arrived through work. That changed everything. She opened the notebook to a blank page and started writing. Not the answer for Renato. She already knew that, with the clarity with which she knew Albarino paired with Grupper. The answer was yes. The question was how. And the how deserved an entire page. The next morning, before going to class, she called Professor Claudia Martins, coordinator of the gastronomy course. She explained the situation in general terms. Claudia listened attentively. "It's a real opportunity," Claudia said, "but you need to enter with clarity about what you are delivering and what you receive in return. Don't let it become a favor. Do it as a professional." Isabella noted in the notebook, "Don't let it become a favor." The following Tuesday, when Renato arrived at table 2, she took a folded sheet from her apron pocket and set it on the table. "I thought about your proposal. Here is what I can offer." He read it carefully, without haste. When he reached the end, he set the paper down and looked at her. "This is great. Exactly what I needed." And there was, in his tone, beneath the professional objectivity, something that sounded like respect, the kind that doesn't need to be declared to be recognized. Isabella put the notebook away and went back to the kitchen. There was a lot of work ahead. Menus to assemble, suppliers to contact, service details to plan. But there was also something that pulsed discreetly under all that practical organization. It was the feeling that things were moving, that the sketch in the notebook was gaining more defined edges, that the path she had chosen to travel from the beginning, without shortcuts and without her father's name, was reaching a point she couldn't see clearly yet, but felt like someone who feels the sea before turning the corner, by the smell, by the humidity in the air, by the certainty that precedes the vision. The event was scheduled for a Friday at the end of the month, in a space Renato had rented in a restored old warehouse in the historic port of Santos, a place with exposed brick walls, dark wood beams, and high windows that opened to the canal. It was the kind of environment that needed little decoration because it already had enough soul. Isabella understood that immediately on the visit they made together. They had arrived at the warehouse on a Monday morning with the winter light of Santos entering horizontally through the windows and making the brick glow in a copper tone. Renato had entered talking about logistics, number of tables, layout, sound system. Isabella had stood still for a moment, just looking at the space, calibrating everything. And then she had started walking slowly around the perimeter, touching the walls, opening the windows one by one, testing the acoustics with a snap of her fingers. Renato had stopped talking and observed her. "Are you hearing something?" he asked with a genuine curiosity without irony. "I'm organizing the table in my head," she replied. "The space calls for a U-shaped layout, with the main table facing the canal windows. The lighting needs to be warm, never cold. And no tall arrangements. Nothing that blocks the line of sight between the guests." He was silent for a second. Then, "Can you take care of all that?" "It's what you hired," she said naturally. There was something in that exchange that was different from the restaurant conversations. There they were two professionals in a workspace, assessing a problem and dividing responsibilities. The asymmetry of the floor had disappeared, and with it, paradoxically, part of the tension that existed between the two had also vanished. That tension born on a night of wines and apologies, and which had become more complex with each Tuesday dinner. In the following days, Isabella worked with an intensity that her colleagues at Terrazzo Ancora noticed. She arrived earlier, left later, studied the international guests' preferences at night. She put together a menu that traversed the São Paulo coast without being folkloric. Oysters from Cananea, pink shrimp from the Baixada, wild sea bass, finished with sweets that recalled the colonial coffee of the interior without being obvious. For each dish, a precise pairing. For each pairing, a narrative she had written in a few lines so the sommelier hired for the night could present it fluently. Chef Marcos had provided 2 assistants to help with production and had said, with that economy of words that was his trademark, that the menu was impeccable. For Isabella, those two words were worth more than any elaborate praise. 3 days before the event, Renato found her at the warehouse during one of the check-in visits and stood watching while she organized the technical service sheets with the concentration of someone disarming something that needs to work at the exact second. "Do you sleep?" he asked. She looked up from the sheets. "When I need to." He sat on one of the still stacked chairs and watched her for a while longer. There was something different in the way he looked at her in those days of preparation, a quality of attention that wasn't that of the customer observing the waitress, nor of the contractor supervising the consultant. It was more personal than that, more honest. Isabella noticed, and she didn't pretend she hadn't noticed. "Renato," she said without looking up from the sheets, "you're distracting me." He gave that low laugh she had learned to recognize as the most reliable sign that he was being genuine. "Sorry." She smiled sideways, her back to him, and said nothing more. But the silence that followed had a different texture from the previous silences. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who have passed the phase of needing to fill the air with words and haven't yet reached the next phase, but who know each in their own way that the next phase exists. The night of the event arrived with a speed that always surprises when one is working hard for something. Isabella arrived 2 hours before the guests, in different clothes for the first time in weeks, without an apron, simply the side of her that work covered, finally visible in the right context. Renato arrived half an hour later and stood at the entrance for a second, seeing her coordinate the service team with calmness and precision. She didn't notice he had stopped. She was checking the temperature of the white wines in the bucket and giving instructions to the sommelier about the exact moment to open each bottle. He watched for almost a minute before entering. The dinner was a success of the kind that doesn't need to be declared, because it manifests in the right silences. The one that comes after the first sip of wine when it hits the mark. The one that settles over a table when the dish is so good that conversation stops for an involuntary moment. The 30 guests, among European investors, port partners, and businessmen from the logistics sector, traversed the menu with the concentration and pleasure of those being led along a very well-traced path. Isabella circulated through the room all night with that skillful invisibility of high-level service, present when necessary, absent when the moment belonged to the guests. The sommelier fulfilled the presentation she had scripted with precision. The service team maintained the pace without stumbles. The warehouse, with its copper light and its windows open to the canal, was exactly what she had predicted it would be. Between the main course and dessert, one of the guests, a white-haired Dutchman who had been quiet for most of the night, called her discreetly. "Who curated this menu?" he asked in English, with that directness that the Dutch have as a second language. "I curated it, sir." He looked at her attentively. "Do you have a background in gastronomy?" "I'm finishing my degree, but I worked in Lyon for 18 months. The Dutchman nodded slowly, with the kind of approval that comes from someone who knows what they are approving. Then he said, "If you ever want to present your work in an international context, send me an email." And he handed her a card. Isabella took the card with both hands, as she had learned to do with business cards in Japan, a gesture she had incorporated out of pure respect, despite never having been there. She thanked him with the sobriety the moment demanded, and continued working. Later, at the end of the night, when the last guests were saying goodbye and the team was starting the teardown, Renato found her near the canal windows. He had been impeccable all night, the host who knew when to speak and when to yield space, who had presented the menu with words she had given him, and which he had made sound like his own, which was exactly what she wanted. "You were extraordinary," he said, without excess adjectives, just that one. "Thank you. The team was very good." "I'm not talking about the team." She looked at him. The light from the canal entered through the windows and drew irregular reflections on the dark wood ceiling. In the background, the sommelier was collecting the last bottles. The night had cooled slightly. "There's something I need to tell you," he said then, and there was in his tone a seriousness different from all the seriousnesses she had known in him until then. It wasn't the seriousness of the businessman. It was something else. It was the seriousness of someone who has reached a point where not doing something seems harder than doing it. Isabella waited. What Renato had to tell was not what Isabella expected. She had expected, with that practical and direct part that governed her, that it would be something about the event, about business, about a next project, or perhaps with the other part of her, the one that recognized the specific weight of how he had said, "There's something I need to tell you," that it would be something more personal. What she hadn't expected was that it would be both things at the same time, intertwined in a way that made it impossible to separate the professional from the human. He spoke about Hendrik van der Berg, owner of a network of gastronomic spaces in 5 European countries, places that mixed regional cuisine, wines, and culture. He had spoken with Hendrik after dinner. The Dutchman wanted to know if she would be open to talking about a project in Portugal. Isabella stood still. In Portugal? In Lisbon? He is opening a new space there. He wants someone with a solid background and sensitivity for the Brazilian product. Your presentation tonight was exactly what he was looking for. She processed that in silence for a few seconds. The canal sparkled outside. The team worked in the background with that soft sound of the end of an event that she knew by heart. "Did you talk to him about me before talking to me?" she asked. The question wasn't an accusation. It was from someone who needs to understand the outlines of a situation before anything else. He said yes, that he had noticed Hendrik's interest during dinner, and that he had fueled the conversation because he thought it was fair to do so. Then he added, "But I want to make it clear that I'm not pushing you into anything. You can completely ignore the card he gave you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that this possibility exists." Isabella looked at him for a long second, and then, before any answer about the Lisbon project, she asked the question that had been underneath everything since that night had begun. "And what did you want to tell me that isn't about Hendrik?" Renato was silent. It was the first time, in all the weeks of coexistence, that she saw him not knowing exactly what to say. It wasn't the hesitation of someone who is lying. It was of someone who is trying to be honest and knows that honesty, at that moment, has weight. "I came here tonight," he said finally, "not just as a contractor. I came because I wanted to be here. I wanted to see what you were going to do with this space. And when I saw, not starting from the event, but from the beginning, since Good Friday with the wine, I began to understand that what I was feeling wasn't professional admiration. Or it wasn't just that." She didn't move. The light from the canal continued drawing reflections on the ceiling. "I'm not asking you for anything," he added. "I just thought it was dishonest not to say it." Isabella was silent for another moment. Then she looked at the windows, at the canal, at the reflections moving on the surface of the water, with the patience of those who are in no rush. And she said, "I didn't come to work at this event just as a consultant either." It was a small sentence, but there was in it a precision that dispensed with any elaboration. Renato heard her with that entire attention she had learned to recognize in him as his truest form of being present. "But," she continued, "we need to do this right, with time, without skipping steps that matter." He nodded. There was in the gesture the seriousness of someone who understands that certain things only work if built slowly, like wines that need barrel time to become what they have the potential to be. They were silent for another moment, side by side near the windows, while the last of the guests left in the background and the team turned off half the lights. Santos sparkled outside with that specific mixture of port and coastal city, hard and beautiful at the same time. It was then that Isabella decided it was time to tell him what she hadn't yet told. "There's something you don't know about me," she said, "and that I should have said before, but I didn't say because—" She paused, looking for the right words. "Because I wanted you to know me first, before knowing the name." Renato looked at her with an attention that was almost physical. "My father's name is Antonio Fontana," she said, "from Fontana Importações." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences of the night. Renato said nothing for a few seconds. She saw in his face the internal movement of someone who is reorganizing information, not with discomfort, but with that specific attention of someone who realizes that the map they had in their head just gained a new outline. "Fontana Importações," he repeated slowly. "Your father is Antonio Fontana." "Yes." He was silent for another second. Then he said, "I know the name. Everyone in the port sector knows the Fontana name." "I know," she replied, "and you are working in an apron in a restaurant." She faced him with that serenity that was her deepest mark. "I am finishing my training, my way, with my money, with my work." Renato looked at her for a long moment. There was in his face something she was learning to recognize as the sign that something real was happening inside him. Not the performance of an emotion, but the thing itself. "Why are you telling me now?" he asked. "Why not before?" She thought for an instant before answering. "Because when you arrived that Friday and tried to diminish me, I wanted to know who you were when you thought I had no value beyond the apron. And because when you came back and changed, I wanted to be sure you were changing for who I am, not for the name I carry." Renato was quiet, and then slowly he gave a low laugh, not of irony, not of embarrassment, but of recognition. The kind of laughter that appears when someone realizes they were assessed with seriousness and that the assessment, even if difficult, was fair. "You put me to a test without telling me," he said. "You put yourself in that situation," she replied gently. "I merely observed." He nodded slowly, and then, with an honesty she had learned to expect from him in recent weeks, "Did I pass?" She looked at him. She thought of that Friday with the mispronounced wine, the apology at the end of the night, the quiet Tuesday dinners, the professional proposal treated with seriousness, the conversation near the canal windows that night. "You are passing," she said. "You haven't reached the end yet." He smiled, and this time the smile had an openness she hadn't seen in any of the previous smiles. They were silent for a while longer without haste, listening to the soft noise of the team finishing the teardown in the background. The Santos night entered through the windows with the smell of salt and the patience of the sea. At some point, without either of them making a ceremony of it, Renato lightly touched his arm to hers at the edge of the window. She did not move away. There was a slowness in that gesture that was exactly the right slowness. Like a wine that is not aggressive, that does not impose, that simply opens up little by little to those who have enough attention to wait. Later, while supervising the closing, the sommelier returned Hendrik van der Berg's card to her. She looked at it for a second. Lisbon. She put it in her pocket. There was time to think about it. But first there was Santos, the port canal outside, and a man near the windows who had started as a problem and was becoming something that didn't yet have a name, but that she felt with the clarity of a good wine on the first gulp, immediate, precise, and impossible to ignore. The weeks that followed the warehouse event were different, not because things changed abruptly, but because they changed the only way that matters, slowly, with consistency. Renato kept showing up on Tuesdays. He arrived without formality, sat like someone who returned to a place they recognize as theirs. Sometimes he brought work matters. Sometimes he was silent, eating what she chose, listening to the pianist. In those silences, there was a complicity she had learned to recognize as a reliable sign that something was working. She, in turn, had sent an email to Hendrik van der Berg. Not a definitive answer, it was too early for that, but an answer that opened the conversation, that presented her portfolio professionally, and that signaled interest without committing before understanding what, in fact, was being proposed. Hendrik replied in 2 days with an extensive, detailed message, which showed he had paid attention that night at the warehouse with an acuity that went beyond social politeness. The Lisbon project was real. It was a space for gastronomic experiences with curation of Brazilian products in the European context, an idea Isabella had had smaller versions of in her own sketchbook, and which was now presenting itself on a scale she hadn't imagined so soon. Hendrik wanted someone who understood both sides, the Brazilian product with all its richness and the European consumer's expectation with all its sophistication. He had seen that in her that night. She showed the email to Professor Claudia Martins. Claudia read it twice slowly, and then was silent for a moment that Isabella learned to respect as a sign that something serious was being thought. "This is bigger than you were expecting," Claudia said finally. "Much bigger. When do you finish your degree?" 2 months. Claudia looked at her with that mixture of pride and pragmatism that was the mark of the best teacher Isabella had ever had. 2 months is enough to build an answer that is neither haste nor cowardice. Isabella noted, enough not to be haste or cowardice. It was on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after the event, that Renato made her a second proposal. And this time, it wasn't professional. He had finished dinner, the pianist was putting away the sheet music, and the two were on the veranda, emptier than usual, with the canal wind arriving colder than in previous weeks, signaling the onset of autumn in the Baixada Santista. "Hi, Isabella," he said with that tone she had learned to recognize as when he was going to say something that cost him. She waited. "I'm not good at this, at saying what I feel with the right words. I've been good my whole life at building things, companies, contracts, structures, but at saying what I feel with clarity without it sounding like a deal being closed, I'm not good." She looked at him. "But I want to try," he said, "with you, if you want to try too." There was a simplicity in the sentence that wasn't a lack of eloquence. It was the most honest way he had found to say something true, and Isabella, who had spent her life learning to distinguish what is authentic from what is performance, recognized the difference immediately. She was silent for a second. The canal sparkled. The pianist closed the case with a soft click. "I want to," she said, "but it will be at my pace, and it will be with total honesty on both sides." "On both sides," he agreed, without hesitating. And then Isabella looked at him, at the man who had entered that restaurant weeks earlier, as a force of nature accustomed to not being questioned, and who was now sitting on the veranda of Terrasso Ancora, asking permission to enter her life, with the humility of someone who understood that certain doors only open from the inside, and thought that the wine was right once again. The best labels never announce themselves. They need those who know how to wait, pay attention, and recognize the exact moment when everything is ready. The problem wasn't the wine. It never was. The problem was always knowing how to hear what it had to say. She stood up from the chair, went to the service station, and came back with 2 glasses and a bottle she had kept there since the beginning of the night, with an intention she herself hadn't named yet. It was a Chateau Neuf du Pape Blanc, the same label from the first night, the one she had suggested when he had ordered the wrong red. Renato looked at the bottle and gave that low, genuine laugh that was, Isabella had discovered, the truest version of him. "You keep bottled grudges," he said. "It's not a grudge," she replied, while opening the wine with the usual precision. "It's memory. It's different." She served the 2 glasses and sat back down. She pushed one of the glasses toward him with the same precise and uncomplicated gesture with which she had done everything at work during those weeks. And Renato took it by the stem, as he had learned to do, looked at the liquid for a second with real attention, not of performance, but of someone finally paying attention to what he had before him, and drank. They stayed there for over an hour, talking about things without urgency, the Lisbon project, which Isabella was still pondering carefully, her father, whom Renato said he wanted to meet someday in an honest way, not because he was Antonio Fontana, but because he was the man who had raised someone capable of going to Lyon in an apron and coming back with a straight spine. Santos, which both had chosen in completely different ways, but which both recognized as a place that belongs more to the sea than to the land, and that's why it never leaves anyone completely still. When the last employee turned off the internal lights and wished them good night, they were still on the veranda, the glasses almost empty, the canal outside with its always different reflections. Donizete passed through the exit and looked at the two without saying anything, but with a smile that was, for him, the equivalent of an entire story told at once. Isabella kept looking at the canal after Renato left. She had chosen the path: Lyon, the apron, Terrasso Ancora, the handwritten proposal in a recipe notebook. And the path had brought a mispronounced wine, an apology at an empty table, weeks of Tuesdays, a brick warehouse with windows to the canal, and a man who had learned in the right order that the value of things is not on the label. She turned off the veranda light, grabbed her coat, and left through the corridor that smelled of wood and wine, and the story of Seu Raimundo Alcântara printed in every detail. Outside, Santos breathed with that mixture of port and coast that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, in exactly that way. and Isabella Fontana walked down the street toward Gonzaga with the usual step, firm, calm, without haste, carrying in her pocket a card from Lisbon, and in her chest the clarity of someone who knows exactly where they are and where they are going. 6 months later. The space didn't have a name yet, at least not an official, registered, printed on a plaque name. It had an address, a villa in the Ambaré neighborhood, in Santos, with an old tile facade that Seu Raimundo had pointed out when he heard she was looking. It had whitewashed walls and a small cellar in the back with controlled temperature. It had a counter made of reclaimed wood that Isabella had found in a warehouse in São Vicente and carried there on a Saturday afternoon with the help of 2 college friends. It had a wine list curated by her, a collection of small-scale Brazilian producers she had visited during the months of preparation, and a menu that changed every week according to what the Santos market had best. It also had, on an October night, the first 20 chairs occupied by 20 people who had arrived without knowing exactly what to expect and who were leaving without wanting to go. That was the sign Isabella was waiting for. Not praise, not recognition, but that specific moment when people need more time in a place because the place did something to them that they are still understanding. Graduation had been in August, a simple ceremony with Professor Claudia Martins in the front row and Antonio Fontana beside her, the father who had arrived from Campinas in a suit without a tie and applauded his daughter with the energy of someone who waited without ever rushing. Renato had arrived too late to sit in the ceremony and had stood in the back of the hall, which Isabella only discovered when she turned around after receiving her diploma and saw him there, in a light shirt and an expression she already knew how to read as genuine pride mixed with the self-awareness of someone who knows they arrived at the right moment, but not in the protagonist's place. And it was good that way. It was exactly the right place for him to be. Lisbon had been left for the following year. Isabella had responded to Hendrik van der Berg with a proposal for occasional collaboration. She would curate a menu for the Lisbon space as an external consultant, keeping the business in Santos as a base. Hendrik had accepted with enthusiasm and with the comment that the response had arrived with exactly the maturity he expected from someone who knew what they had. She had read that sentence 3 times before saving the email. On the opening night of the unnamed space, Renato arrived before the other guests, something Isabella had asked him not to do because she needed the pre-opening time to check everything calmly, and which he had respected for 3 entire months of preparation, and had broken exactly on that night, because there were certain things he was still learning to do in the right measure. But he arrived with his hands behind his back, which was the sign that there was something that wasn't just him. She crossed her arms. "What is this?" He took his hands from behind his back. A bottle. She didn't need to read the label. "Chateau Neuf du Pape Blanc," she said with a half-smile. "From the same vintage," he said. "I looked for 3 weeks." She looked at the bottle for a second, then she looked at him, and she thought, with that part of her that had never stopped being the girl who learned wine names before learning to walk a bicycle, and with that other part that had gone to Lyon empty-handed and come back with everything she needed, that there were things money and influence could buy, and there were things only conquered by the whole path. The difference between the two was the difference between possessing something and deserving something. "Come in," she said, "but wait for me to finish preparing the cellar before opening this." He entered and stood in the middle of the unnamed space, looking at the whitewashed walls, the reclaimed wood counter, the aligned bottles, the warm light she had chosen because she had learned at Terrazzo Ancora that lighting is the first hospitality a space offers. And there was in his face an expression she didn't need to be looking at to know was there. Later, when the 20 guests had already arrived and the night had taken the soft rhythm of a good story that tells itself, Donizetti appeared at the door with a bottle, a sparkling wine from a small producer in the Serra Gaúcha that Isabella had mentioned once in passing, as one of the best she had tasted in Brazil. "Did you memorize what I said about wines?" she asked with a smile. "No," he replied. "I called your father and asked for a suggestion." Isabella looked at him for a second. Antonio Fontana had chosen a sparkling wine for the opening of his daughter's cellar. It was exactly the kind of thing he would do. Discreet, precise, without any gesture larger than necessary. And absolutely right. She hugged Donizete, who stood with that slightly enchanted rigidity of someone who wasn't expecting it, but was satisfied with the result. The night advanced with wine, conversation, and the right light. At a certain point near midnight, Isabella stood in the doorframe that led to the street and looked inside the space. She saw Renato talking to two of the guests with that attention he had learned to have, listening more than talking, asking the right questions at the right time. She saw Donizete explaining something about one of the wines to a young woman who was taking notes on her phone. She saw the space functioning as she had imagined it would, not as a place that impresses, but as a place that welcomes. It was different from Lion. It was different from Terrasso Ancora. It was entirely hers, built with her hands and her choices and her time. Without shortcuts, without her father's name, without any network she hadn't woven herself, thread by thread, with the patience of those who know that important things are not rushed. She thought of that Friday night with the arrogant man and the mispronounced wine. She thought of how easy it would have been to let it pass, to have served the table with professional indifference and left without anything changing. But there was something in her that couldn't pretend she didn't know what she knew, that couldn't be in a place without truly being there. And sometimes, when one is truly in a place, the place changes, and sometimes the people around change with it. Renato came to her at the doorframe. He stood beside her, looking in. "It's exactly what I imagined when you described it," he said. "You remembered?" "Every word," he replied. "You said you wanted a place that told stories through food, and this is it." She didn't answer, but she lightly touched her shoulder to his, just as he had touched his arm to hers that night at the warehouse, with the right slowness, without ceremony, like someone who finally arrived at a place after a path that was worth every step. Dear listener, if you have come this far with Isabella and Renato, you know that this story is not just about wine or about a seaside restaurant. It's about what happens when someone decides to travel the whole path instead of using the shortcut, about what is revealed when arrogance meets quiet knowledge, about the second chances that only exist for those who have enough humility to recognize they were wrong and enough courage to say it out loud. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments the moment you felt Renato was truly changing, or the moment you realized who Isabella really was beneath the apron. These stories exist because you listen, comment, and share, and each comment is the equivalent of serving a good wine to those who know how to appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this journey. Leave a like, which makes all the difference, and we'll see you in the next story, which, like all good wine, will be worth the wait. End of story.